Hello, Nelson Ford from the Gunsmith in Phoenix, Arizona, and we're going to cover some early Colts. There's so much to cover on Sam Colt and what happened in the early years. It's almost perplexing. The guy, we all know him as a gun inventor. He was a magician. I said I wasn't going to go off on him, but you should know that he had the patent for insulated wire. He ran the wires for Alexander Graham Bell on his first phone call. He designed mines and wanted to mine the Hudson and the Potomac, and he tried to get Congress to buy the mines from him, and he did displays of them. He did lots of things, but I'm going to do a separate thing on Sam. So we're gonna start with his guns and how troubling it was for him. He financed his early gun endeavors by selling or getting people high on laughing gas. Yes, he did. He had a donkey that pulled a tank around, and he went to the various cities around Hartford and in the Connecticut area, and he was a salesman, and people said he was a salesman of the highest order and an influencer, and he would find the most affluent looking person in the early evening, people coming out of restaurants or bars, and he would say, "Hey, you got to try this laughing gas. It'll give you strength beyond your wildest dreams, um, make you happy beyond your wildest dreams." And he sold his laughing gas treatment for 25 cents, which would have gotten you steak dinner back then in the 1820s. And he would come back to his a small rented shop. It wasn't a machine shop, but it was a machine shop of sorts. He wasn't that he's still in his late teens. I think he wasn't that well financed, and his gunsmiths would be gone because they ran out of money for oil to keep the office or the workshop warm, and they weren't getting paid on a regular basis, and he was always out trying to make money to bring back, and he lost a lot of gunsmiths early on, um, but um, he finally got the financing, and he had. They say he started the revolver, the Colt revolver. Was the first American-made revolver. I think there were foreign revolver prior to that. But he claims he designed the cylinder on a ship, and he whittled out the cylinder and what have you, and that's still on display at Colt's Museum. But in the 1830s, he started Patent Firearms. I don't know whether it's Colt Patent Firearms or Patent Firearms, and he was in um, New Jersey, Patterson, New Jersey, and he was making the first revolvers. They were 28 caliber, the baby um, percussion revolver, and then he made the number 2, 3, 4, and 5. The 5 was the big one that's called the Texan, and he made a total of 2,800 of them over about a 5-year period, and people didn't know what to do with them. The baby was tiny, it was a great little gun, but we weren't in any wars. We didn't have any war contracts. We didn't have any big problems. But they sold here and there, and I think Texas, and this is where it gets interesting. The Texas Navy bought 200 of them, and the Texas Army bought 40 of them. And somehow these guns were acquired by Hayes. He was a Texas Ranger. I think it was Jack Hayes. Jay Hayes, Jack Hayes. Anyway, he and Sam Walker and others procured a number of these firearms, and they started using them on horseback. And when they had problems with Indians, they stayed on their horses, and they used these revolvers. And not these, Pattersons. I don't have a Patterson here. A nice condition Patterson could be between $500,000 and $1 million beyond my pocketbook. I had a friend that had one. I've held one. That's as far as it got. But they used these Pattersons in a battle called Walker's Creek. Sam Walker had I think about 30 or 40 of these guns, and they were on horseback, and there was 15 of them, and they ran into these Indians, 75 or 100 of them, and they bested them. They had severe injuries to some of their guys. In fact, Sam Walker was pinned to the earth with a spear from an Indian, but he lived. Hayes was there, and they bested these Indians because they had repeating revolvers. And prior to that, they had with rifles, and it was a whole different situation. And Hayes likes to think he started the whole pistols on horseback because that kind of changed everything as far as the cowboy era. You know, they were all on horseback with pistols. Of course, they had their Winchesters, but Winchesters weren't made yet, and they weren't going to be made for a while. And so this was an exciting occurrence at Walker's Creek, and it went down in folklore. And Walker said, we've got to get a hold of this guy and get more of these guns. They're fabulous, and they're giving us an advantage that we never had before." And so he tried to get a hold of Colt, and he did. And Colt said, "I think it's a wonderful idea. I don't know whether," he said, "I have been languishing in poverty because my revolver company went bankrupt, and I don't even have a working model that I kept out of 2,800 revolvers." And so Walker helped him get financing, and they got started again, and they made up a bunch of these guns. I think and they made up 30,000 of the Walkers. Walker wanted a longer barrel. It's a 9-inch barrel, I think. This huge cylinder holds at least 40 or 50 grains of powder, I think even more. And the gun's 4.5 pounds. This is going to pull your pants down. And so, they made 30,000 of these. And the Texas Rangers bought 100 of them or 1,000 of them right off the bat. And they even put a scene rolled into the cylinder from Walker's Creek battle, or the Battle of Walker's Creek. And so everybody knows this gun is the Walker, and now we know why, because he got Colt back in business and got him going again. So they're a great gun. One notable thing is when the gun recoiled, often your charge uh, cylinder seater or your ball seater would drop down, and that would lock the cylinder, and that became a problem. And so they did come up with the second model, the slightly shorter cylinder. Something I should mention: this gun in 1847, when it came out, and I think Walker died at the end of the year of 47, so he wasn't able to tout his gun very long. Um, Pushed the ball, 130 grain ball. I think they used a bigger ball than these at almost 1,300 feet per second, making it really the world's first Magnum. And this gun was the most powerful handgun in the world from 1847 till 1935, when the 357 Magnum came out in 1935. And what other gun can say that it held the most powerful handgun in the world for 88 years? Unbelievable. But at 4.5 pounds, and it had some faults, they did make another improvement. They called them the Dragoons. And the Dragoons had the lock on the front. And that way you didn't have to worry about the rod falling down when you were shooting. It was a slightly shorter cylinder and a slightly shorter gun, but it's still a tank. And I don't know how these guys move these things around. I'm sorry that these are replicas, but if they were real in this condition, you'd be looking at $750,000 to $1 million on the Walker, and the Dragoon would be very close behind it. Most of them were really used. They were tools. So that gets us past the Walker. and how Colt got back into making firearms. But selling 30,000 of them paid for the tooling and kind of kept him going, but didn't really make him a lot of money. Didn't put him where he wanted to be. And so people were saying, how about a little gun we can carry? And in 1849, they came out with the 1849 Pocket Colt. They called it 31 caliber. I think it's actually 312. Today we would call it the 32. All the 32s are actually, I think, 312s. But this is the first of the 32s, and people should note that because the 32 has gone a long way. And what this gun did for Sam Colt, because of its portability and its size, is it sold 340,000 copies. Remember, this gun was discontinued in 1873 when Colt got the cartridge guns. That's a whole other story with Roland White and the patent, and they let Roland go, and then they had to wait until the patent expired so they could use Roland White's patent to make cartridge guns. But um, these little guns in 32, they sold 10, 10 times as many of these as the Walkers. And that put Colt on the map, and it gave him a bank account to work from, and it solidified him. And so that gun, and I have this other Colt here because I want to mention it. People think of 32s, and they go, well, 32 is, that's just a little pocket gun. It's not for anything good. What do you do with that? This is a 32 Colt, John Browning design, 1903 model, and it's far from what we're talking about, but it's closer than you think because it's also a 32 in a little gun, and they sold 500,000 of these, 500,000 of these, and that's the way to make money. Copies, lots of them, and that's the only reason I have that little 32 here because it's in alignment with this other little 32 that put Colt on the map. And then we could continue. They had all the 32s that the New York State or City Police were using, all the different police departments across the East Coast all used 32 revolvers. They used lots of them. Colt made them. Smith made them as early as 1896. They made swing out cylinders in 32 that they were using. And to just to bring it right up to date, the Lipsy's 432 UC is another 32, and here it is, 2025, and it's one of the hot sellers from Smith & Wesson today. So the 32 actually plays a big part in the world. It's not just a little pocket gun. It's a formidable piece. Now, Colt loved to name things after the Army and the Navy and the police. They had the police positive, sector special. They always use the names. Now they're on snake guns. But this is the 1851 Navy. This is a 36 caliber ball. It's another thing they did. They actually said the real caliber. All of our 38 special pocket guns, they're 36s. They're 3.58s. They're not even 36s. They're 35s. But we call them 38s. They used the real caliber designation on this, and they called it the 36 Navy. We would call it the 38 today. And the 36 Navy, or the 51 Navy, did very well for Sam as well, selling 220,000 copies. I wish I had this went to a Pennsylvania regiment, by the way. This gun was made in 1858, just before the Civil War. And I might as well tell you the little pocket was made in 1868, just after the Civil War. But in everything all the way up till 1873, these percussion pistols were still king, and a lot of people used them. Terrible thing to have to use in the rain. If you didn't have wax to wax the fronts, people didn't have wax. You'd fire one round. I had a guy bring in a 36 to my store very early on, and I wasn't educated in these guns very well. Probably 80 or 81. I was just opened, and he brought one in that was loaded, and he had 6 caps on it. And he wanted me to go. He asked me if I had a place to fire it, so he wanted the gun unloaded. And I said, sure, I can do that. I put on some phones and some hearing protection, went back to my test fire tube in the ground, cocked the hammer back, pulled the trigger, and 4 rounds went off. The spark jumped to three other chambers, and 4 rounds went off. That'll give you an idea of why people didn't like the Patterson revolving rifles. There were 1,800 of those, and I didn't discuss those because that's a rifle, not a pistol. A lot of those went down to Florida to fight somebody down in Florida. I don't remember, but that taught me a lesson early on that you need to wax the fronts, and that these guns did crazy things. They'd fire 2 rounds at a time or 3 rounds, and that means the rounds are going down the side of the barrel. And if your hand's out there on a rifle, you're going to catch those balls, and you're going to bleed to death probably. But at any rate, this is the 51. She was issued to in Larry over at Waco Arms on Cave Creek Road. Had the book on him, and I should have got the book from him. He's since been deceased, and he closed and his store was closed, and it went to a Pennsylvania cavalry or division or something. But then after that came the 1860, and I don't have one here to show you, and that was the Army. They called it the 1860 Army, and I believe it was in a large caliber. It was in 44, and those sold real well. And you saw, and believe it or not, Colt sold guns to both the North and the South. A lot of people think because he was in the North, the South didn't get his guns. They sure as hell did, just not as many, because I think at some point, some people started surrounding his factory and saying, these are our guns. You're not shipping them out of here anymore. But so there's a mouthful on the early Colts and how he had a lot of he was an adventurous man. He had a lot of failures, and I could go on with other things he did, but I'm going to save that for a Sam Colt story. But he went up and down and up and down, and he died of the rich man's disease, the king's disease. He had gout. I think he died at the age of 49. He was born in 1814 and died in 62, I think. And so he got to see some pretty big players and the 1860, but he never saw his company manufacture cartridge guns. And by the way, these guns were converted to cartridge by doing machining and boring out the back. And people were able to put 38 caliber cartridges or thereabouts in these revolvers, and they were then cartridge revolvers. There is one fun story. He had a son named Collie, and Collie liked yachts and fun women, and he wasn't big in the company like Dan Wesson's kids were working at. Joe Wesson worked in the company. I think Collie had a good time, and his father was the richest man in the country, or the richest man in Connecticut, at least, for quite a time. And he was shot clambering out the bedroom window of a home on Florida Keys, second floor, by an irate husband. And it's just an interesting thing to show you when you have too much money and loose women and yachts. A lot of things can happen. So thanks for watching. Oh, and we have accoutrements here, nipple wrenches, cap seaters, balls, and powder measure. We would have all been familiar with this stuff if we were born a while back. And this wasn't this long ago. My great-grandfather was born in 1856, before this gun was made. And my grandfather was born in 88. They would have still been used in a lot of these black powder guns, and people would have been familiar with these different accoutrements. And so they're not that far off. So with these different accoutrements over here that I have out to sea, these are for loading primers. And you pull back this rod, there's a spring, and this one you take apart and load them in there. There's a wheel, and you'll be able to see the cap with a close-up. There's a row of them in here that go right up to the knob. And after you put powder in your cylinder like this, you take your ball. There's a cutaway on the Pattersons. There wasn't a cutaway to load the ball on the gun. You had to take the cylinder off the gun and load it off the gun, and it came with a little tool to do that. But on this gun, you drop the ball in, and then you take the rod and push the ball in. A lot of guys had these things. Put the cylinder down at rest, let center. You push the ball in, and then when you get that close, you would take the cylinder and roll it around, and you take that cap and just push it right on there, and then pull out to the side, and the next one snap right up in place, and then you do the next one, you do the next one. But you would load the powder in the ball without putting the caps on, unless you were ready to shoot or you wanted a gun to be at the ready. But a lot of times you wouldn't put the caps on until you needed them. And the caps are a tragedy. You know, you fire around, you go to cock it back again, the cap has come apart. They're little thin, tin things. The cap would come apart in little fragments and to be in there and get between the cylinder and the wall, and they wouldn't want to cock back. I spent some time with this Dragoon, and it shot remarkably well. I mean, I was getting groups like this at 7 yards offhand, and that gun shoots. So they work at close range, and but they are dangerous. And can you set off a cap trying to put it on there, and then a ball comes down here? These weren't really the best way to go, and that's why they're considered a non-firearm by the ATF. But they're a lot of fun. Time flies. Hope you enjoyed the Colt video, and send your comments and questions. I love learning from you guys.